Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Keely Weyker. I'm the Director of Engagement and Outreach at the Everglades Foundation, and excited to be here to talk with you all and talk about Everglades restoration and why it's important to us here in South Florida. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. If you just mind, I'm going to switch it to presentation. I'm happy to put my email in the chat too following the presentation if you guys have any questions following the presentation that we're not able to answer, or I don't have the exact answer at the time. So I'll put that in the chat at the end. A little background on myself before I get started too. I actually have a background working a little bit with wildlife, so I'm happy to be here with you all in the Wildlife Center. I used to work with sea turtle hatchlings, and then before that, I did animal education with mainly reptiles. So I have a little bit of hands-on experience working with those different wildlife and animals. So always happy and have so much admiration for folks that do work with wildlife. It's a tough job, but it's very rewarding. So before we get started, I always like to kind of set the stage, kind of show pictures of the Everglades and be able to bring everyone out there, even though we're virtual, just kind of show this beautiful landscape. And so these are photos I've taken over my time in the Everglades. So just introducing the different habitats. The Everglades has so many different habitats, from big cypress to sawgrass, even to prairies. We have mangroves and pine rockland. So there's just a bunch of different habitats within the Everglades. But we also have an abundance of wildlife. So we're the only place in the world that has both alligators and crocodiles, which I always find really cool. But we also have over 2,000 species of plants and animals that call the Everglades home. And we're known for these wildlife. A lot of this wildlife brings folks down here to visit, and then we as residents love enjoying the wildlife too. And within these 2,000 species, we have 78 threatened and endangered animals that make up the Everglades. And so these different species are great. They're nesting here. They live here full time, or maybe they're just temporarily here. They are seasonal. So these wildlife and the habitats are hugely important to restoration. And so I always just like to show a little bit of these photographs. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, this is my Harry Potter hawk. I love his little lightning bolts on his forehead. So always like sharing that picture. And so the question is, why do we need Everglades restoration? What's going on, and why is it important? And so I always like to share this graphic because it shows our historic flow, which, as you can see, there's nothing in the way. It's going from the Kissimmee chain of lakes, starting in Orlando at Shingle Creek, all the way through to Lake Okeechobee, and then ultimately through the Central Everglades, Everglades National Park to Florida Bay. And there's nothing that's kind of diverting that water. But over time, we've diverted water, and the Everglades is half of its original size. And that is hugely important because we have two seasons here in Florida. We have the wet and the dry season. And those play in different roles as it relates to the Everglades. So at some points, because of our size and what we have left of the Everglades, we have an abundance of water, and then at times we have not enough water. And so it's all about getting that water right through Everglades restoration. The other thing is when Lake Okeechobee gets too high, that man-made dike that's around it, that becomes a potential threat that it could breach. And so the Army Corps of Engineers has to release water at a certain level that the lake is at. And so what happens is in the summertime, a lot of that muck that's in the lake, we get blue-green algae blooms. And so the lake gets pretty much 60 to 70% covered. I don't know the exact percentage it is today, but in the summertime, we get a covered lake. And so what happens is in the wet season, the lake gets high, the lake is covered in blue-green algae, and they have to release that water east and west. And so what happens is you're releasing water that also includes blue-green algae. And so that blue-green algae goes to Stewart, that blue-green algae goes to Fort Myers, and they get blue-green algae blooms that cause fish kills. It causes human health issues. It causes just a detriment to the community there. You're seeing economic harm, you're seeing environmental harm. And so the goal of restoration is to cut down these discharges and get the water to where it needs to go. The other thing that you see on the right side, I think it's the right side for me, but on the right side is our Chief Science Officer, Steve Davis. He's holding a bunch of dead seagrass, and that occurs in Florida Bay when there's not enough fresh water getting down there. And so what restoration does as well is reconnects that system. So we're seeing salinity levels without restoration in Florida Bay higher than the ocean, and that causes massive seagrass die-offs. And so what it's really doing is getting that fresh water down there to balance that salinity to keep the seagrasses healthy. And so when we look at the far right image, and I'm going to minimize everyone so I can see my whole screen, what we see on the far right is a restored Everglades. And that really comes to the reason that we're here. And so the Everglades Foundation is working to restore and protect America's Everglades through science, advocacy, and education. So we have a team of scientists that range from economists to engineers to hydrogeologists to ecologists, to name a few. They're a team of scientists that look at Everglades restoration, whether it's through resiliency, through project modeling, the economic benefits of restoration. And they create reports, they create papers, they advise on restoration projects. And then we bring that to advocacy. So when we go to DC, we go to Tallahassee, we're utilizing what our science team produces, and we're using that to advocate for Everglades restoration. And we got the science and we got the advocacy down, but we realized you need to educate that next generation. These are the future protectors of the Everglades, the future stewards. And so they need to understand the Everglades and why it's important to them. And so we actually have a really robust education program as well. And so how do you restore the Everglades? How does this work? How does the process play out? And so that's through the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This plan was signed in 2000. It was actually the last thing that Clinton signed while he was in office. And this project lays out a 30-year plan. It's bipartisan, and it's a 50-50 cost share. So what that means is that the federal government and the state government have to equally pay into this program. There's 68 projects that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District then manage. So they do the planning together, they get the funds together, and then they complete the construction together. And so this is a huge project. There's nothing of its kind before. And so we're really leading the way on how we can restore various ecosystems through Everglades restoration. And so I just want to highlight one of the big projects in restoration, which is the EAA reservoir. And this project is really important because it reconnects the lake to the central Everglades. It's a project that's the size of Manhattan. So if you look on the map, it looks fairly tiny. And I'm actually going to go to another map that makes it look even tinier, same old map. But if you look at that blue dot, I'm going to put my cursor over right here. That is the EAA reservoir. And so what that project does is it takes lake water, cleans it, and then sends it south. And it really decreases discharges by over 50% for the lake. And so this is really important because we need an area to store water. I mentioned before that the Everglades is half of its original size. So anywhere that we can store and treat water is impactful and important. So that's a really big project for us, and it's moving along as we speak with new contracts and construction. Okay, and another project I want to highlight is the Tamiami Trail bridges. I don't know if you guys have driven over Tamiami Trail, but before the bridges, and currently in some parts, it's still level with that canal that runs alongside it. And when we think of restoration, we're thinking big projects, big reservoirs, but as simple as a bridge can really reconnect a system and provide huge benefits. So these bridgings have created 3.5 miles of water flow underneath, so connecting Conservation Area 3A to Everglades National Park. And so what that does is it creates a freshwater flow that wasn't necessarily there before. And it creates a plant life that wasn't there before too, creating what was originally there. So before it was a lot drier, so you had a different habitat makeup. And now you're seeing what was naturally there before through that water flow. And this is something where we could see restoration immediately. We could see the effects on the plant life and the water flow and the movement of that water. So I always like to say, it's like it's as simple as a bridge can reconnect a system and qualify as Everglades restoration. And so a lot of this is expensive. It costs money. So when I talked about the federal and state dollars that had to be shared, the cost share, this is something that is appropriated every year to the state and the federal government decides how much is appropriated to the Corps and the South Florida Water Management District to use for restoration. And so, as you can see, looking at 2014 and 2024, there's been a huge increase. And that's just because we've, as the Everglades Foundation and our NGO partners, as well as our state and federal partners, have seen just an improvement in the momentum for Everglades restoration. And so we're seeing huge investment in this project, and it's allowing us to really speed up that timeline and really hit the marks before that 2030 goal. When you always establish a goal, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to meet it, but we're really seeing a lot of the benefits, a lot of ribbon cuttings, a lot of groundbreakings that's making that Everglades restoration goal even closer. And so what our advocacy team does is advocate for these dollars on behalf of the federal and state entities. We do not receive any of this funding ourselves, but we do go in there and speak for these agencies in order to advocate for them to get the funding. Okay, so what's the benefit? We're spending a lot of money. When this first passed in 2000, they originally estimated restoration was going to cost maybe $7 billion. We're looking at now $23 billion. So why invest this money in Everglades restoration? And it's really about the benefits that it creates for South Florida. And that includes our economy, it includes our resiliency, our national parks that are down here, even the quality of life here. And then more importantly, the wildlife that inhabits this area. So Everglades restoration has a ton of benefits. And so I'm just going to dive into a couple of them. And I'll show you why it's important. So one of them is carbon sequestration. We've been doing a lot more research on why this is important and how wetlands do that. And so the really cool thing is wetlands, mangroves, seagrass, they're all sequestering carbon. And so we have one of the largest wetlands, and what it's doing is it's basically stockpiling carbon in that peat soil. So if you've ever been on a swamp walk or on an airboat tour, when you look down, it's that brown muck that's within the Everglades. And so it's that when it's wet is holding that carbon. So when that soil stays wet, it's holding the carbon. And then additionally, the mangroves are also sequestering it. Seagrass is sequestering it. So it's having huge benefits as it relates to that. And then you can see these numbers on here. I'll just read a couple of them. Carbon stocks within the water conservation area. So just directly west of us here in Broward County, 7 million homes energy consumption for a year. I mean, that's huge. The other thing is mangrove forests, they're sequestering that carbon, and that's valued at nearly $3 billion. So these are really big impacts with these wetlands, and it's all about keeping them wet. We don't want them to dry out, because if they dry out, that peat soil could potentially burn off, releasing that carbon, or with wind, it could blow off. And so keeping that soil wet, keeping it healthy, keeps that carbon in. The other big thing is resiliency. So when you have a healthy wetland, you can see the density of the peat soil we have here. And so it goes from grass, water, peat soil to limestone. And so when you have a high peat soil that's healthy and it's keeping wet, it's keeping that carbon in, but it's also creating elevation. And that elevation allows for us to have more resiliency against saltwater intrusion, against sea level rise. And the other thing is when it's wet, you're keeping that limestone wet, you're keeping the aquifer wet, and it's creating this freshwater barrier force against that saltwater intrusion. Because once the saltwater gets into our aquifer, that takes away our drinking water supply. So we want to keep that fresh water. We want to keep that Everglades hydrated to keep the Everglades healthy, but also to create resiliency for our community down here. Okay. And then another benefit I highlighted before, or I touched on, was our economy. And so we have people that come to South Florida. They are tourists or they move here, and they're here to, you know, they're a part of the economy and they're part of the community. And so they're spending funds. And so when we have a healthy Everglades, a healthy estuary, people come and they want to spend time on the beach. When you have blue-green algae blooms, fish kills, the water is toxic to swim in, people aren't going to visit Florida. And so that creates economic harm to these communities. The other thing is outdoor recreation, the boating industry. We always like to highlight, when you talk to a boat manufacturer, they may not be necessarily here in Florida, but they might feel the economic impact if there's a algae bloom. That means that people aren't buying boats, people aren't boating. And so what that does is that impacts an industry that's not even within the state of Florida. And so we can see wide economic impacts when we have these algae blooms. There was a hotel owner in Sanibel that said he faced more economic impact during the 2018 water crisis than he did during the pandemic. And so you're seeing people canceling reservations, not coming down here to vacation because of these blue-green algae blooms, or if it's making red tide last longer by feeding the bloom through blue-green algae and the discharges. The other thing is, most of us probably enjoy outdoor recreating as members of the community. And so we're also contributing to that economic benefit by going out, by kayaking, by boating, by hiking, biking, whatever you do out in the Everglades, you are putting into that economic value. And so when there is an unhealthy ecosystem, we're also not recreating. So just like to highlight just the economic benefits of Everglades restoration, that is creating a healthy ecosystem that allows for this to continue. Okay, the other thing, I mentioned educating the next generation. We're also educating or providing adult education. And so we did a survey in Broward and Miami-Dade County asking folks, where does your water come from? And what we heard back was only 5% of people realize that their water comes from the Everglades. And that's really impactful to know where your water comes from. And so what we did is we launched a program to educate adults through whether it's billboards to videos to social media, even doing presentations like this to bring awareness that your water does come from the Everglades. And we have it in 3 different languages. I just have Spanish and English here. We also have it in Creole, but we're just really trying to connect the community to the Everglades. You don't necessarily need to go out there, but you need to understand that your water does come from this important ecosystem. So this is just some of the graphics that we created, and we continue to do that today. And then lastly, I'm going to turn to my last page because education always has a lot of facts and numbers, so I want to get them correct. So our education program, has curriculum that's approved by the state, and it's in 30 different counties. They've taught over 6,500 teachers, and over 200 plus students have been impacted by this education program. And so this curriculum is created by our education team, and they not only come into the schools and teach the teachers, but they also provide everything you need for that curriculum. So whether it's Play-Doh to create the Everglades or hula hoops to do a game, our team provides all the necessary items that you'll need to teach that course or that curriculum in your classroom. And then additionally, they do come in and they teach the teachers. So just in Broward County, they've taught over 750 teachers, and then they have 19 champion schools. And so the cool thing about these champion schools is they teach the curriculum, but they also make the Everglades about their everyday life in the school. So whether it's having a mural to remind them what the Everglades is, or making sure that they're tied into their math programming or their English programming. So all of this really ties into what a champion school is, and the fact that Broward has almost 20 is a really big deal. Okay, so the last map, we're trying to get to that restored Everglades. We're trying to reconnect the system through Everglades restoration. And so this is the largest ecosystem restoration project in the world, and there's a lot of eyes on us to see how we handle it and how we do it. Because what we do with this project is really going to be the example for others that are working on restoration projects. So I always like to say it's kind of a beacon of hope that we're so far along in it. We're getting projects done, and we're showing that we can restore an ecosystem, and it's exciting to see where we're at. But I just want to thank you all for having me today. I'm happy to answer any questions. Um, and I'll take down my slides, or if we need to bring them back up, I'm happy to do that. Stop sharing.
Awesome. Does anyone have any questions? You can either unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out. Did you have any, like, are there any wild animals specifically that you personally have worked with out there that you've seen while you're doing
Um,
there?
we often see alligators. I did work with alligators at a different place, not, of course, in the Everglades, but yeah, we see a lot of wildlife, mainly birds, but you'll see um your alligator or two out there as well.
Oh, cool. Okay. At least one of our volunteers said thank you. So that's awesome. All right, well, you can hear Goji in the background. He's a red-shouldered hawk that we have as an ambassador. He was shot and taken to a rehab center in Tampa, where he's from. And he's been with us for almost a year, but he likes to hang out in my office, so he throws tantrums. And so I'll bring him in. There was one question, how can someone get involved with restoration?
Sure, I would recommend, and I'm happy to, if we do a follow-up email, or I can drop it in the chat. If you follow us on social or join our newsletter list, I would say that's the best way to keep up with what's going on. The other thing is we often send out updates on restoration, but we also send out alerts if there's something that we need folks to activate on, whether it's a bad bill or support for funding. We work on those types of alerts. So that's a way to participate in Everglades restoration, of just letting folks know why this is important to you, and that, it's on your radar, what's going on, and you want either those that are elected to support it, or even just awareness for your community.
Very cool. Okay, awesome. All right, well, if you guys don't have any other questions, I'm going to stop the recording.